Welcome to Chapter 4 of your Human Geography text. So we'll be discussing a little bit about the geography of health and disease. So what's really important to understand about health and disease is that it does have a place and it's actually something that we can study. This idea of medical geography is quite large and quite new within our realm of the social sciences because we're able to look at a particular disease and see where it's spread. What's really interesting about this idea of medical geography also is that it helps us understand more the cultural landscape that can be affected by a different disease, whether it be because of perhaps maybe a mosquito, or are we looking more at disease in the idea of cultural influences, such as economics, such as living standards, such as sexuality. These are all different attributes of this, and we'll be able to talk a little bit about that during this chapter of the text. So the book takes very simplistic concepts looking like at malaria. How is malaria transmitted? How do we see an outbreak? It's based off of mosquitoes that are infected by the disease, and then they bite people, and how it spreads throughout that piece. So it looks at really kind of the historical influence of that. Also looks at the ideas of DDT, which was a pesticide that was produced and sprayed on vegetation and agriculture back in the 40s and 1950s. Then they used it again in the 70s, but nonetheless, looking at these different chemicals that were used as pesticides that then got consumed by people. It also starts introducing ideas of cancer, that we identify that cancer is a disease, that it is also something that is not, it is natural that we can have cancerous cells within our bodies, but also how can those cancer cells be influenced, and then how can that be then aggressively grown? They found that there can be lots of chemicals and living standards, work environments, working in asbestos mines, being exposed to lead paint, also being exposed to different variations of solar energy by skin cancer. So these are all things that we can look at as being a causation, but then we can also look into the cultural influence, perhaps the national heritage or the ethnicity, being simply the pigmentation on the skin. Are certain colors of skin more susceptible to burning and being susceptible to then skin cancers or not? Uh, just a very different perspective. What I think is also interesting is he brings up the idea of Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley was really because of the um, production and burning of fossil fuels and different chemicals that were then pushed into the water as wastewater, known as the Love Canal. You'll learn a little bit about that. There's a video as well that introduces the Love Canal, which is one of the most famous environmental disasters in this location. And pretty much everyone that lived in the area, consumed the water in the area, did develop a particular type of cancer. And talking about that landscape. Uh, Moving forward, it starts introducing traditional, what we consider like world regional geography content, looking at birth rates, life expectancy rates, death rates, mental health rates, disability. It also discusses a little about autism, vaccinations. There's some really interesting discussions about autism and vaccinations, and that how many scientists are pushing towards the idea that autism not being vaccination causation, but being more of hormonal. And well, where does that come from? Well, hormonal can come from genetics, but it can also be from the meat market. For not more recently, but in more recent past, most of the meats that were consumed, the animals were injected with growth hormones to make chicken breasts very large, turkey breasts really large, cows very large, to be able to produce more meat faster. And finding that those hormones are actually absorbed within the human body, and then those hormones can then cause different types of defects. And so those are some interesting pieces of kind of our landscape and um, who can be affected by those pieces. Another thing that's really interesting that the book kind of wraps up with is looking at the access to healthcare. And that's a huge piece of medical geography, is that who actually has access to healthcare and what does that do upon a landscape. And what we find is that not everyone has access to healthcare. Not everyone has access to birth control. Not everyone has access to just the necessities of life. I mean, to tell you a very quick story, a friend of mine was she was camping, and she was camping on the ground in her little tent and had the door open. and a little rodent ran into her tent and slept in her hair. But anyway, the feces of that animal actually gave her bubonic plague, which is it is available in the world. It wiped out entire countries of people, but it, all she had to do was go to the doctors, and they gave her a little packet of 3 pills, and then she was cured. Something so simple in other countries would completely devastate third world countries if bubonic plague were to go wild. When here in the United States, we can go to a clinic and pick up 3 white pills that can resolve that. So, what is available? What about trauma care? We find that trauma maps are very, very important for us to understand because they try to build trauma centers in locations that are more affected by different types of health. So maybe you look at a more violent area, they're going to have more of these trauma centers. But what if there's not? How far do you have to travel in order to reach a trauma center? What if your community is not able to afford the rights to have trauma centers, and so you have to travel large distances? What if you live in the middle of nowhere and you're out in the Mojave, you've got a large ranch, and you get hurt or something happens? How are you transported from that place to a local hospital? And that's really things that we plot out. If you think about it, ambulances have GPS units that we use maps that can depict based on light sequences being like traffic lights, traffic, time. How can an ambulance get from one spot A to B in the shortest amount of time and distance? Because every second counts. The book then wraps up looking at something that's really large in our culture today, which is quite sad, which is the oxycodone and um, the pain kill epidemic that we're dealing with and abusing those prescriptions that have been involved. Obviously, we need to understand that an addiction is a disease. That's not something that people choose, and that it is something that needs to be dealt with. But how do we deal with that? How do we help people that have these diseases of addiction? And it's not just with pill types. It's also dealing with alcohol and other types of addictions. They've Psychologists and scientists alone have proven that those are also diseases. Those are diseases that people will live with the rest of their lives. And how do we help support them and support the people to try to eliminate the abuse of pain-killing prescriptions and other substances? Those are things that we're plotting, things that we can look at, things that we can study. Uh, Politically, looking going forward, how are we as a nation and as a culture and a society going to deal with healthcare? How are we going to deal with these attributes? How do we help people that maybe are not just citizens, but people that may be residences or people that might be dreamers or otherwise labeled perhaps even individuals that are illegal? How do we help people with healthcare? How do we come to an understanding of the cost and the profitability, and how do we share that so that way people can take advantage of these resources to be safe and to live a healthy life? How do we approach that? And those are things that are really going to be talked about. If you ever take a world regional course, they talk a lot more about that, looking at other countries and looking at their healthcare and how that's dealt with, and how in our society, healthcare, as an example, we'll look at looking at you know the formality of abortions and the Planned Parenthood. Well, it's not just abortions that are within the Planned Parenthood family. There's also cancer research and other attributes that can help cancer preparedness. It can also be within that realm being contraceptives. There's so many different attributes within that Planned Parenthood bubble that so many people are reliant on, and for many different reasons. So, how do we reach an agreement to help communities as a whole when other countries and other nations don't even have the ability to have a contraceptive because it's not culturally accepted or it's not financially achievable? So these are all things that the book will kind of talk about and things that you'll work through in your discussions as well. So it's a lot of information, but it's kind of interesting because a lot of things that we have, we take advantage of. We're very fortunate to have healthcare. We're very fortunate to be able to access clinics, and there's a lot of people that can't. And this really kind of brings that idea, well, how do we study these landscapes within healthcare, within safety, within, also we'll talk more about it later, but looking at crime and how are those areas affected by this? So we'll talk soon.